Hello, I'm Robin Vincent and welcome to Molten Music Technology. Today we're looking at the Arturia AudioFuse. What a nice glittering little box. The AudioFuse is an advanced audio interface from Arturia, the people behind all those wonderful software instruments, those controllers, MIDI controllers, and now of course synthesizers like the Mini Brute, the Micro Brute, the Maxi Brute, the Middle Brute, the MIDI Brute, and other brutes as well. But what's interesting about the AudioFuse is that it has a little bit of a story to it. It was originally sort of launched in 2015 at NAMM when it looked like the most interesting thing ever. It's got all these things and all these knobs and all these flashing lights and all these ins and all these outs. How very exciting. But then it just failed to materialize. For 2 years it wandered around in kind of limbo, turning up at the odd trade show and then disappearing again without a word. You got the chance perhaps to give it a little poke at Super Booth or at Music Messer, but then nothing was seen of it again until 2017. In 2017 it was finally released. Hurrah! And we all went, hooray, that's great. Although, why did it take them so long? I don't know. We're never going to get to the bottom of that, so we need to sort of move along, really. And so anyway, in 2017, it was released. Fantastic. I'm very, very eager to read reviews on it because it was, once again, one of those sort of interfaces that looked like it could be the ideal interface for me. Now, I know I say that a lot. It's always happening. I'm always on the lookout for the ideal audio interface because I've never really quite found one that fits everything that I want to do. Nearly. I've got my Steinberg UR28M over there that I use all the time on my main desktop machine. And I also picked up the K-Mix, the Keith McMillan K-Mix here, which I thought was perfect, but it's not quite perfect. So anyway, when a box like this comes along, I think, wow, fantastic, this could be the one. However, when the reviews came out, all the reviewers seemed to really like it, which is nice, that's good. And they said how great it ran on the Apple Mac. Okay, but unfortunately it was really kind of disappointing on Windows. What did I mean by that? Well, what they were talking about was the latency, the power of the drivers, if you like, the quality of the driver architecture that routes the audio in and out on Windows was not very good. I mean, the warning signs were there when they originally released this. One of the big features was that it doesn't come with any drivers. Yay! Now on Apple Mac, that's fine, it's all built in. They've only got the one machine it has to work on, and so it works very well. That's all sort of built in and ready to go. But on Windows, that just makes no sense whatsoever, because Windows machines are infinite. They are splendid and wondrous in their variety. There's no USB socket that's the same as any other USB socket. And so you require a well-written driver architecture in order to make audio interfaces work well, without special attention being paid to the drivers, to the protocol, to that connection between the box and Windows. It's just not going to work very well. And that's what people discovered. They went, oh, so on Windows it's just a bit crap. And that was a massive letdown. Massive letdown. What were they thinking? I don't know. I mean, who knows? So after the 2-year wait and then the fanfare of release, I found myself going, oh, that's so disappointing that the AudioFuse is just not going to be up to it. I mean, there is often seems to be some kind of confusion in the minds of manufacturers, people who make audio interfaces. They seem to think that USB drivers with Windows, they just kind of work. And they just kind of do. Well, they do if you're plugging in, I don't know, a QWERTY keyboard or maybe a gaming controller or something like that into USB. But with audio, it just requires something else, something more. It requires more care. And there's a massive variation in the quality of drivers that comes with audio interfaces. So much so that you can change audio interfaces and actually find yourself being able to do a whole load more plugins on the same machine. Or also the opposite is true. Many times I've heard people buying a new posh audio interface to find that actually they can now do less plugins and virtual instruments than they could on their cheap, crappy audio interface. And that's all down to the quality of those drivers. Many manufacturers have been guilty in the past of just taking sort of off-the-shelf generic ASIO drivers for their audio interfaces and then wondering why people complain about their lack of performance. This has nothing to do with audio quality, it's purely to do with the data flowing into and out of the computer. And because we're purely talking about a driver architecture, then it's something that can be improved upon. When I first got my Steinberg UR28M, it was absolutely the most ideal audio interface ever for me. Desktop form factor, nice big knob on the front, good clear connections, but the latency was awful. The audio performance was just embarrassingly terrible. And I had to sort of put it on a shelf for like 6 months. And then finally Steinberg and Yamaha sorted themselves out and released some much, much better drivers for it. And now it's superb. The same thing has happened with the AudioFuse. Arturia have released the 1.1 firmware update, and that sorts it out. So they've listened to the Windows community going, "Whoa, this is a bit rubbish, isn't it?" And they got themselves together. They probably found someone who can write good drivers. And so the happy ending to my little story here is that the AudioFuse now supposedly, allegedly, apparently, has awesome drivers for Windows. It has a round-trip latency now of 3 milliseconds, so the website says. And so this is the reason why I'm taking my time to review the AudioFuse. I know it's already out, I know it's been out there for a while, I know Mac users are having a lovely time, but I wanted to have a look at it from a Windows perspective to see what's going on with those drivers. Are they any good now? What sort of performance can you get out of it? And is this now the most ideal audio interface for me? So my focus in looking at this is not on all the ins and outs necessarily, although there'll be a bit of that. If you want to read about the features and what every single button does, then go and check that out on the website. That's easy enough. What I'm mostly interested in is how well it works. How easy is it to get sound in and out? What that sort of latency is like? What the performance is like? And what does it feel like to use? That's my angle. That's what I'm going to give you. And I hope that works for you. First of all then, a quick look at the actual hardware. Now it does get rather warm, I'm finding, so it's quite cuddly in that respect. It's got a good rubberized bottom, so it's not slipping and sliding around your desk, which is good. It's weighty. Look, it's about the size of my hand, if you can see that. When I've seen it before at trade shows, I've kind of thought it a bit small and fiddly, but now that I've been using it for a couple of weeks, not so much. It's good. The size is all right. It's capable with, and obviously I like a big knob in the middle, and it has one of those. And so, you know, for the most part, I'm happy. It does have a remarkable lid, which is here. And initially I thought, what a waste of time. But now that I have one, that makes it nice for porting it about the place. I'm not going to get the knobs all mucked about, and also it's a good thing for dust, because dust is a constant thing I have in my shed, and so using the lid is quite useful. It really does go on there rather nicely. So lid aside, what sort of ins and outs does it have? Well, that's quite a lot, I have to say. When you've got these two Neutrik combi inputs on the front, mic 1 and mic 2, you've also got two phone sockets on the front, plus mini jack versions of those phone sockets. That's unusual. And then the phone sockets themselves have got these two dedicated massive silver knobs here, which is, I don't know, maybe even a little bit overkill for headphone outputs, but they're there nonetheless, using up a little bit of this tiny amount of front panel real estate that we have. And then on the top you've got two gain knobs, one for each of the input mic channels here. You've got gain, you've got various buttons you can press like phantom power, pad, phase inversion, and also switching between mic, instrument and line. In the middle you've got this big fat output knob. It just controls output level. We'll look at that a little bit in a minute because it's slightly odd and also very good, I think. In this top corner you've got this little, the least liked version of a knob, I think, which is this sort of roller control that goes between direct source going straight through and via computer monitoring source, or somewhere in between. It's useful, it's just not my favourite sort of knob. And then on the back A lot of other stuff going on. We've got inputs 3 and 4, very basic, no controls on the device itself for inputs 3 and 4. And then you've got 2 separate speaker outputs, you know, your main out and a monitor out, something of that nature. You've got these phono inputs here, which is interesting. You don't find that very often on an audio interface, with a ground pin as well. And then you've got 2 inserts, so you can insert something onto the 2 input channels. So you could put it through a compressor or some kind of preamp or effects module, whatever you like. Those are there, which is also quite rare on audio interface and very, very welcome. At the top here, you've got word clock SPDIF, and then the magic ingredient, the thing that really elevates this for me, is ADAT in and out, because that gives you a whole extra 8 channels via an ADAT interface of some kind. And that, the reason why this interests me, I suppose, is that that gives me a possible gateway into modular, either for generating CV through an ADAT to Eurorack module in the modular, or for recording multi-track, multi-channel modular through some kind of ADAT interface into here. So we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. And then over here, another very useful thing, which is MIDI in and out, with these tiny weeny connectors here that you plug in these handy adapters. So you have real life MIDI. And for some reason that's become a rarity on audio interfaces. So that is also very, very welcome. Finishing it off, right at the back here, are these 3 USB ports. It's a little hub. Now that's phenomenal. Everything should have that. I mean, this is complete godsend for using a Surface, because I only have the 1 USB port on there, and so this allows me to plug in my Cubase dongle and the audio interface without having to carry an extra hub. Fantastic. So generally, just to summarize on the old hardware then, it's a good weight, it's got a good feel to it. It is, you know, it's plasticky, but it's solid. It's got a lovely rubberized bottom. It's nice and warm in your hands, not that you have to carry it when it's on or anything. A whole shed load of controls on the front, all sorts of interesting inputs and outputs that kind of covers almost every base you can think of. And so right from the off, you've got a whole stack of useful I/O, useful features, all in this little box. They don't seem to have missed anything out. And that's why the whole thing interested me in the first place. And why that I'm excited to try it out now that they've sorted out the driver problem. Because this could be the one. Now, the AudioFuse can work completely standalone. It doesn't actually need to be connected to a computer to work. However, not every single control is available on this front panel. Much of it is done in the software. So once you disconnect those 2 things, you lose control, for instance, over inputs 3 and 4. There's no physical controls for those whatsoever. They can only be set in hardware. Similarly for the ADAT inputs and outputs. They can only have controls such as level and panning applied within the software interface, not on the unit itself. And there are some things that you can set in the software which actually disappear when you turn the computer off, because it doesn't necessarily change the hardware. Like if you're monitoring something, monitoring levels aren't going to be set in the hardware, they're going to be set in the software. And so if you're using it standalone, those settings then become irrelevant. But the software interface itself is really quite versatile and comprehensive. It reflects everything that you're doing on the hardware, and the hardware tends to reflect everything you do in here. So there's very much a 2-way communication thing going on. So when I hit a button on here, that's then reflected in here, or vice versa. Now there's some kind of intelligent switching or detection going on inside the box, because you can't do anything with the input channels until you've plugged something in. So with nothing plugged in, none of these buttons work. Nothing works at all that I can see. So you can't choose whether it's line, instrument or mic until you physically plug something in. I can't quite decide if that's a good idea or not. That might be a feature, I suppose, but it just means I can't set something up before I plug it in. I don't know. I don't know why that's necessary. I don't know why it's like that, why it needs to be detected at all. Can't you just set something up to be what you want it to be and then plug it in? Does it matter? I don't know. So if I plug a cable in to input 1, Now things start to happen. I've got my instrument light that's lit up here, and I can press pad, and that's there. Phase invert, that's there. Plus 48. That's not working because it's an instrument, not a microphone. Can I change the type? Yes. I can change between line and instrument. Why is that? Because it's only a mono jack that I've plugged in. Does it have to be an XLR in order for it to be a microphone? So instrument line. Instrument line. How do I get it to be mic? Well, let's find an XLR cable. Let me plug that in. See, now it's a microphone, and I can't switch that. See, that's quite interesting because it is detecting what sort of cable it is. I assume just by the physicality of plugging it in. The thing is that I have a Variax, a guitar, which has an acoustic output which uses XLR in order to give it a balanced line into your DAW or whatever you're going through. So I could plug a guitar via an XLR cable into here, but it would detect it as mic, and it doesn't allow me to change it to line. What about if I was using a balanced cable, a balanced TRS cable like that? What would that be detected as? Again, line or instrument. So that's kind of an unexpected restriction in some regard, that it detects what you plug in, but that means that you're restricted to what you can plug in. So if I have, for instance, a microphone that has a TRS output on the end, which happens, I can't use it with this. I have to have XLR. Or if I've got a guitar with an XLR output, or another instrument that has XLR outputs, or I'm coming in from a line device, a DI box, for instance, with XLR outputs into this, it's not going to detect it correctly. So the answer to that, obviously, is to get the right cables for what you need. So let's plug a guitar in just to see what happens. So I've got it on line input, so I hit the instrument button there and it changes to instrument. And all the lights come on. So let's just check out kind of the signal flow. So I've got a guitar plugged in. I've got a nice gain knob here, which is also reflected on the screen in the software. I've also got this knob on the side here, this one here, which gives me direct monitoring. So this is straight through. Or I can go through, all the way through the computer, which of course gives me no output whatsoever because it's not going through any software. At the moment, I'd need to start up my DAW and enable a track and do monitoring that way. Now I can also set monitoring level within here. I have a direct monitoring mix, and I've got a nice control that I can bring down so I can't hear anything, or I can bring it all the way up. I can pan it left and right, I can solo and mute. It has a fairly comprehensive little mixer in there, which we'll look at a little bit later. The overall volume is controlled by this big fat knob here in the middle, which is kind of interesting. I mean, when you turn it here, you get these blue lights around the side light up. And in the software here, you purely get kind of a change in dB. That's the only real indication. Although I can see that the graphic of the knob is sort of turning, you can't really see that. But it is showing you the dB amount that you're going. Now the play in this knob is quite strange in that if I turn it quickly, it tends to move up and down really quick. And then when I turn it slower, it moves slowly. That doesn't seem to make any sense. What I mean is that there's something going on in that it's not a consistent turn. So if I turn it a quarter turn, for instance, how far that goes up or down will depend greatly on the speed of that. So if I turn it slowly, a quarter turn, it hardly moves at all. If I turn it quickly, a quarter turn, it whacks up and down. Again, it's one of those features where I can't quite decide whether that's a great thing or not such a great thing. I don't know. I'm not sure. But if I show you what it looks like here, as I turn it, you'll see the blue lights. If I turn this down a little bit to there, can you see the blue lights that come on? if I turn it slowly, it hardly moves. Turn it quick and it goes up. And then when you strum, you get nice green lights, giving you peak lights at the top. So in some ways, when it comes to the hardware, it's almost a little bit too intelligent. It's kind of doing a little bit too much for you. The knob is very responsive, but then it's intelligently deciding whether you want to go loud and go soft or just do it a little bit, which I can see that once you got used to it, that can be very handy. It's just that I'm finding myself reaching across to it and turning it a little bit, and then having to turn it really hard in order to actually get it to do what I want it to do. I wonder if there's an adjustment for that in the software. I don't know. But the controls and the combination of the controls on the hardware and the software is pretty comprehensive. It's all there. I mean, for instance, I mentioned about how inputs 3 and 4 don't have any controls on the hardware. Those controls are here. And when you set them here, the gain, for instance, you can leave that and it will retain it. It's moving something within the box itself. So when you close the software or close the computer, that setting remains, which is great because I often have my modular plugged into 3 and 4 just to monitor through. And it's always there at the right level that I've set, regardless of whether my surface is on or not. So that's probably as far as I want to go and tell you about the included control center software, because it does the job. It looks great. You can resize it nice and big. In fact, it even works multi-touch. Can you believe that? Multi-touch. Which I imagine is completely unintentional, but there it is. You can move 2 things at once, 3 things at once with your fingers if you wish. And there's one last really little neat function, which is this glowing Arturia symbol up in the top left corner. When you press it, the software goes away. When I press it, it comes back slowly, which is just a fantastic little feature. So when you've turned your computer on, or you need to change something, or you need to get to the settings, you can just bring that straight up without having to dive around on a mouse or in a menu or try to find a shortcut. It's there just off this little power button here. Genius. When I find genius, I really like to point it out. That is genius. Right, so let's get in and dirty with those drivers then. What am I going to do? Well, first of all, I'm going to roll out the good old Dawbench test just to see how many plugins it can handle at a given latency level. I mean, this for me is always the first test to do because it shows whether the USB ASIO drivers are working correctly or not. I mean, for a long time I've used my Avid Fast Track Duo as kind of my benchmark interface because it's half decent. It does a half decent job. The performance is all right, the drivers are pretty good, and so it's a good thing to measure things by. And thankfully it's been a little while since I've come across an audio interface that does really, really poorly. And so if the AudioFuse is at least as good as that, then we'll know that they've done a half decent job. So here I am in Cubase, I've got Dawbench loaded. Let's just have a quick look at the drivers. So if we go to the ASIO control panel, we can see that it's set to 256 samples, has this safe mode, which we'll look at in a minute, and it's currently giving us a input and output latency of 10 in and about 8.5 out. That sort of latency is all right. It's what I expect for 256 samples, is around about, just about under 10 milliseconds for output latency. And that, for most applications, for mixing certainly, mostly for playing, depending on what your feel is like, and for monitoring, it's all right. It's good, it's standard, it's the sort of thing that we're normally after. Under 10 milliseconds is, in my view, what we want when we're talking about low latency operation. So in terms of playback, I've now got 60 plugins running. The idea with Dawbench, in case you're not aware of it, it's simply a project which is running 40 sine waves and a little bit of musical audio next to it. And what you do is you insert a known plugin onto every single one of those 40 tracks and then keep adding plugins until it crackles. And it gives you a plugin count, if you like. You can download it from dawbench.com, you can do it yourself on your own machine with the same plugins and get kind of a comparable result. It's very, very useful. And of course the result will be a mixture of the performance of the audio interface and the processing power of your system. So in this instance, it is happily right up at the peak on 60 plugins. And that is absolutely what I would expect from a USB audio interface running at 10 milliseconds on my Surface Pro 2017 i5 8GB. It's about right. It's what the Fast Track Duo is able to accomplish. It's what my K-Mix can do. All of my audio interfaces, my USB ones that I have at the moment, test at around about this sort of level. So the AudioFuse is absolutely in line with those, which to me means it's good. It's a good thing. It means that the audio driver is not hampering its performance. It means it's giving the usual sort of performance I would expect, so they have not screwed it up. So that's like test one passed. Excellent. So if we take that down now to 128 samples, which is reporting an input latency of 5.3 and an output latency of 4.4. That's pretty good. That's now getting down to real levels of real-time low latency. We like that. Anything that's under 5 milliseconds is really going for it. Now, funnily enough, at 128 samples, I would have expected a little bit of drop in plugin performance, but it's pretty much identical. There doesn't seem to be any difference at all. So in some respects, you can get to a lower latency without really any loss in performance. Or the flip side of that is that you can increase latency and not do very much more than you were doing already. I'm not exactly sure what that says about the Arturia drivers other than it's performing really well at 128 samples. Now, scarily, it goes down to 8 samples. You never see 8 samples as a buffer size option on any audio interface. You just don't see it, but it's here. So I guess we should keep going down and just check to see how far this rabbit hole goes. So 64 samples gives us an input and output latency of 2.9 and 2.4 respectively. Under 3 milliseconds for an input output is remarkable. So let's give that a whirl. Okay, we're getting a little bit of glitching now, which is not unexpected at 64 samples. So if I pull out a few of these plugins, okay, that seems to be giving me stable playback at about 54 plugins, which is still excellent. At 32 samples, the input latency has dropped to 2.2 from 2.9, but the output latency has stayed where it is at just under 2.5, which is interesting. So at 32 samples, the performance is about the same, but because the output latency was the same, that's sort of to be expected, really. So let's crank it down to 16. Again, the output latency has remained the same, but the input latency has been squeezed down to 1.86, which is nuts. But at the moment, we're really only dealing with output. Okay, the system is having to work extra hard to keep the audio playback under control, but again, the performance is still very, very similar. So at 8 samples, we have an input latency of 1.68 milliseconds and an output still at 2.49. So this, at its lowest setting, is giving you a round trip latency of about 4 milliseconds, which for a USB audio interface is quite remarkable. Now the computer's having to work really hard to keep that audio playback together, but it is at 54 plugins, the same as we had at 128, was it? No, same as we had at 64 samples. It's still hanging in there. That's amazing. Oh, there it goes. So I probably need to turn it down a little bit, but it is offering up these quite extraordinary latency figures that do seem to be performing correctly. But the thing is it all about that safe mode? Because safe mode often implies that they are sticking in a safety buffer, an extra bit of latency in order to ensure that the playback is maintained. That's why the buffer size has stayed at 2.5 for the output latency, because they've added in a safety buffer to ensure smooth playback. So what happens if we take that away? Let's see, shall we? All right, let's bump ourselves back up to 128 and take safe mode off. It now has an output latency of 2.49 and an input latency of 5.4, whereas before it was about 5 and 5. So taking safe mode off has halved the output latency. Is that going to work? Is that going to work? Let's try. Yeah, we're back up to 55 plugins, which is very similar to what it had when it had safe mode on. So at 128 samples, the safe mode is kind of neither here nor there. So let's push it a bit further. Okay, now we're talking. At 64 samples, we've got an input latency of about 3 and an output latency of 1.5. Let's see how that goes. Okay, that's still holding it together at 55 plugins. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. 32 samples then. It keeps the output latency at 1.5, but the input latency has now become 2.2. Okay, there's clicks now in the output, I can hear. So let's keep going down. Well, I've gone now all the way down to no plugins, and it's still glitching. So with no plugins running, with no load on the processor at all other than the playing back of audio, the AudioFuse is unable to handle it at that sort of buffer size with safe mode off, without the additional sort of safety buffer that it uses in order to ensure good audio playback. It ends up just glitching. So at 16 samples then, which gives us 1.86 and 1.5, what does that do? It just clicks. And so just to round this off, let's go down to 8 milliseconds. And that gives us the 1.68 and 1.5 milliseconds. Now this is what they're talking about their 3 millisecond round trip latency. An input and output latency added up to make, more or less 3 milliseconds. And that's what they stick on their website. It has a 3 milliseconds round trip latency. Does it? Does it? Well, it's certainly something that you can select. But if you can't get glitch-free playback, then what's the point of it? What's the point of it? Well, I spoke to Arturia about this, and they did say that they were totally able to get stable playback through an 8 millisecond buffer size without safe mode on a Windows computer. They said that they had a computer that could do it. I'm not convinced by that. I think it's more of a, if you forgive me, it's more of a marketing thing. They wanted to say that they could do a 3 millisecond round trip latency, and so that's what they've given us. They've given us the ability to create a 3 millisecond round trip latency. But unfortunately, the reality of the USB data stream is that it's just too small a buffer to create a glitch-free playback with. However, I will do a couple more tests just to give them the benefit of the doubt and to demonstrate how or not if that works. So what else could we do? If we do something which is just tracking, just putting audio in and through, using that 3 milliseconds round trip, just monitoring the guitar through the software, would that be a good way of testing it? So direct monitoring, guitar. And then go to through the computer. Now you can see it being monitored through Cubase here. There's our playback. There's our 3 millisecond round trip latency. Oh yeah. So let's pull back to see at what point we get decent playback. So that's our 8 samples. Let's go to 16 samples. No. Let's try 32 samples. No. 64 samples. So we're now back up to 4.5 millisecond round trip latency. At 128 samples, we are back up to 2.5 on the output. There it is. There it is. Stable playback. Oh yeah. Stable playback's what we want. Yeah, stable playback's what we want. Yeah, it is. Ooh. So there you have it, 2.5 milliseconds. That is, in my experience, with all my years, these long years, the long beardiness that I have in this industry, 2.5 milliseconds is about the limit for glitch-free playback from a USB audio interface on a Windows computer. That is more or less it, unless you have, well, even if you have something like an RME Babyface or a Fireface or one of their UFX things, getting below 2.5 milliseconds is an extraordinary feat. And the AudioFuse, although it gives you the options, it just can't do it. Once you get to 2.5 milliseconds, then stable playback. Anything under that, it's just going to crap out. USB is just not up to the task. That's the thing. Now, obviously, if I enable safe mode, then that's going to keep that output latency above or around 2.5 milliseconds, and so that should work the entire time, all the way down. Let's go down to 32. There you go, that's running at almost sort of 4.5, 5 milliseconds round trip latency. If I go down to 8 milliseconds, yeah, that's too hard because the input latency is now down to 1.6 milliseconds, and that's too low. It's too low. It can't cope with it. Up at 16, yeah, still a bit glitchy. So, the lesson that we are learning here is that a round trip latency of less than 5 milliseconds is gonna crap out. It doesn't matter what the marketing says, doesn't matter what the website says. Under 5 milliseconds over USB for a round trip latency, so that's 2.5 milliseconds in, 2.5 milliseconds out. That is about as good as it's gonna get on USB. That's about it. Anything under that, you're gonna be running into glitching. Unless there's some kind of special circumstance going on, or maybe some Uber computer which is capable of handling it. One more little test then, just to really nail this bugger. One more test then with a virtual instrument. So not Cubase, nothing else in the way, purely a virtual instrument. How about one of Arturia's virtual instruments? That sounds like a good idea. Let's choose the piano. So we are now down to 8 milliseconds. Safe mode is off. No, it ain't gonna work. Let's go up to 16 milliseconds. No. 32. No. 64. No. 128, which takes us above the magic number of 2.5 milliseconds. There you are. But even that's a little bit glitchy, but it's starting to get there. 256. Perfect. Almost. So let's turn safe mode back on then. And now it starts to behave itself. If I take it down to 128, there you go, down to 64. Now the buffer size is being claimed to be 1.5 milliseconds within piano version 2, but we know it's not that because of the safe mode that's turned on gives it a slightly larger buffer size of 2.5, as it says here in the control panel. So you shouldn't always believe what your software is telling you. It can be different. But now we've got it stuck at 2.5 with the safe mode. It's perfect. So I think I've really laboured that point now that the AudioFuse and the Arturia Control Center software and the driver gives you access to all these buffer sizes and all these very, very, very low latencies that you cannot use. I mean, maybe, just maybe, on your computer it works, But there's nothing remarkable about the USB port on the Surface Pro that I'm using here. There's nothing great about it, there's nothing terrible about it. It just works like most of them do. And I believe that most systems are going to give the same sort of performance as what you're seeing here. But what I find just really odd is that you are given these options at all. I mean, why give you the option to do it if it doesn't really work? Is it so important to get down to that magic 3 millisecond number? I don't know why that's magic. I don't know who it is who has said that that is a magic round trip latency you need to get to. I don't know. I mean, most people working with normal USB audio interfaces have a completely fine timer under 10 milliseconds for a round trip, or under 5 milliseconds for an output latency. Playing response, all those sort of things around 5 to 10 milliseconds are fine. It's what we all live with. It's completely fine. It's like standing a couple of yards away from a speaker. It's no big deal. And so I'm just slightly sort of befuddled as to why they would offer up this unsafe mode in order to give you access to really, really low latencies that just don't work. I mean, personally, if it was me, they should remove all this unsafe stuff and just have the safe mode buffers, but remove the word safe mode and just have it as, these are our buffer sizes. And that way you can get down to some extraordinarily low latencies, like 2.5 millisecond output, and have that play back perfectly. And having an input around about the same, so you've got a 5 millisecond round trip latency. That's excellent. That's top performance. That's fabulous. And they should focus on that. Why give us these options that don't work? That just frustrates the hell out of me. However, frustration aside, the performance is fabulous. It's excellent. And all this silly messing around with safe mode or not safe mode should not detract from the fact that the performance of the drivers, of the ASIO driver for Windows and the AudioFuse, is working tremendously well. Great performance, a great number of plugins was playing back, great latency, great monitoring latency through it all. It just works brilliantly. The whole safe mode, not safe mode is just an annoying distraction that really shouldn't be there. So ignore all that, leave safe mode ticked, and you will have a thoroughly happy, high performance, low latency AudioFuse experience. Now that was probably a really good place to stop. However, there's one more thing I wanted to check out on the AudioFuse, and that's its multi-channel ability. So I've come back on a fresh day to check out the ADAT port that's on the back. Now ADAT is an ancient optical digital format that contains 8 channels of audio over a single sort of light pipey thing. It sends an optical, can you see that? Optical signal. Light, red light. And that can plug into the back of the AudioFuse and give us 8 channels of additional audio. Now, how do you access those 8 channels, I hear you ask? Well, you have to use a very handy box like this one. This is called, can you guess? The Ultra Gain Digital, it shouts on the side. It's essentially a mic preamp, an 8-channel mic preamp that has ADAT out on the back. Now, you'll find ADAT on all sorts of things. You'll find it on old digital recorders, you'll find it on mixing desks, digital mixing desks, that kind of thing, and also converters like this one, either line level ones or microphone ones. And what this essentially does is allow you to plug a band into your audio interface. 8 channels, 8 microphones if you like, 8 line sources, 8 whatever you like, and take them straight through here into the AudioFuse, into your computer. Now, if you have one of those large Eurorack style audio interfaces, then you already have that kind of thing built in. So why not buy just a multi-channel audio interface rather than messing around with this ADAT malarkey? Well, it just gives us an option. So rather than having to invest in a big chunky audio interface you've got to carry with you everywhere, you've got a neat small form factor AudioFuse with the potential to expand into larger things that you want to plug it into. I mean, the reason ADAT has stayed around as long as it has is simply because it's useful, tidy, neat, handy, 8 channels of audio, perfect quality, in and out. There's a whole load of boxes and things you can already connect it to. Fabulous. So not only do I have the 4 ins and outs on here, the 2 mics on the front, the instrument inputs and the line inputs, I've also now got access to a whole bank of other inputs as well. So if all my mates come round or a drum kit comes round, I can mic it all up, I can plug instruments in and record the whole lot into my Surface. Awesome. But also if I'm going to a gig and performing at a gig, I can leave that bit behind and just take the AudioFuse, which is perfect for my stereo output because that's all I really need to run to the speakers to perform. And that makes the whole system very easy and very versatile. Now, in my endless search for the perfect audio interface, ADAT has become one of those things. Why? Well, because of the modular. Because of my interest in modular, that's been dragging me towards how can I get all of the outputs from this into the computer easily and separately. Now, I could use a mixer, I could use an audio interface like the K-Mix I've got over here. And that's very possible, but I've kind of fallen out of love with the K-Mix. I just can't get on with the white spongy faders. I just can't. It feels wrong. It grates with me. It feels like, you know, fingers down a chalkboard. It's just not resonating with me. And then there's also a couple of modules out there that will take audio signals or CV signals from your modular and send it over ADAT, which is perfect. So when I'm looking for an audio interface now, because my requirements, you know, evolve and change over time, then I am definitely looking for something which has that ADAT input, and the AudioFuse has it. So with a really sort of neat solution like the ES3 from Expert Sleepers, I can put a little module in here that's got an ADAT output and a bunch of Eurorack patch socket sized inputs, and it will take 8 channels of audio from my Eurorack into my DAW. Brilliant. Or I could get the other one which goes the other way and send control voltage from Bitwig, for instance, or some other sort of modular software, and send that into my rack. Very interesting. Which raises the question, why don't I just get the ES8, which is the Expert Sleepers USB audio interface, which gives you 8 in and 8 out, I think at least, directly via USB to your computer? Well, there's a very specific reason why I don't want to do that, because that's fine, but I can only use one USB audio interface with a Windows computer at a time. And if I'm using the ES8, all I can do is Eurorack in and out. I have nothing else going on, whereas with the AudioFuse, I can still use the guitar inputs and the vocal inputs alongside the stuff coming over ADAT. So I still have a working audio interface plus modular coming in and out. The ES8 doesn't do that. And so for me, for my situation, using ADAT, either via a little module or via a big chunky thing like this, is a far better solution than using something like the ES8. The other alternative is to use an audio interface that has DC coupled inputs and outputs. And I've done a video all about DC and AC coupled audio interfaces, so go and check those out if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But the majority of those sorts of audio interfaces tend to be big chunky ones, Motu ones, RME ones, the Presonus ones, all big things, you know, this sort of size audio interface, where again, I've got the convenience of using a small box connected to another box, rather than an all-in-one situation that I've got to drag around all over the place. I've got something a bit more modular, something that really works for exactly what I'm trying to do. You know, and that ultimately is what I'm after. I don't really care what you're after, I'm just interested in solving my own problems. So with all that information sort of gathered together, let me give you a quick demo of the Eurorack running through the ADAT converter box into the AudioFuse, through the Arturia software, and into Cubase. Or something like that. Let's give it a go. So I've got some stuff here. I've got the output of something here. Let's plug that in. I've got another one here. Lovely. Now all of that is coming out of various oscillators and bits and pieces on my Eurorack and just going 8 channels straight into here. So I've got a bit of a noise thing, a clap thing going on, some bass, some other thing, and other bits and pieces all going in. Got lovely signal lights here flashing away. I've got a little bit of gain control also here so I can adjust the input level. People often talk about the output of Eurorack being quite hot, so having some kind of gain level on your ADAT converter is very, very useful. Now you get no indication on the AudioFuse that anything is going on at all, but in the software you get a whole ADAT monitoring section. So as you can see, you've got monitoring level control, you've also got a bit of panning, have solo and mute buttons as well, which are kind of hard to touch with your fingers for some reason. Takes a couple of goes usually. So you could totally use something like the Surface as a mixing facility for your Eurorack, or of course for any audio that you're bringing in. You can use the Arturia software. It's pretty good. I mean, it is multi-touchable, as I may have mentioned, and I can make it one bit bigger as well to get a little bit more fingers on those knobs and things. But there's other software as well. You could run it through your DAW and use that for mixing and real-time effects processing. You know, the options are endless. But probably what we want to do is record into our DAW so that we can mix it separately and affect it separately, and then start applying automation and effects and different stuff in order to move our Eurorack performance all over the place. Now, the AudioFuse software doesn't have any DSP or effects or plugin facility itself. So if you wanted to add software effects to the audio that's coming in, you'd have to use a DAW or some other piece of VST hosting software. So as I'm now monitoring through software, I want to turn this all the way around to computer and monitor directly through Cubase. So if I was to solo something, let's solo this nice bass sound, and then have all sorts of fun with it. And so on. But of course what you really want to do is record all of that audio into Cubase on individual tracks so you can mix it later. Fabulous. So the ADAT box then, and the ADAT port on the AudioFuse just creates this really versatile, expandable experience and environment that I can use if I choose, or not. I can use a great big, massive mic preamp thing like this, or I can use something smaller that goes into my Eurorack, or I could use a digital mixer. A whole number of things can be stuffed into that ADAT port, provided you have an ADAT out on something. Or you can also go the other way. I can stream all of this out into a multi-channel something else, or I could stream it out through a digital desk and mix with my hands. An ADAT port on an audio interface like this just gives it an extra level of versatility, an extra level of expansion and awesomeness that wouldn't otherwise be there. One note just to make is that any changes you make to the monitoring mixer in the Arturia software do stay when you turn the computer off. So any levels and panning that you make is retained. Obviously, if the computer's off, you can't access any of it, so you can't make any changes. But at least what you've set up will remain, and then you can access it next time you turn the computer on. However, that doesn't actually extend to the mute and solo buttons. So if you've soloed something or muted a load of stuff and then turn your computer off, it'll suddenly all come back again, a bit like this. And when you come back into Windows and back into the Arturia software, the mute and solo buttons are all just cancelled. But that's not a major deal, it's a little tiny thing. And my other note is just to point out that I can also use these other inputs on the front and on the back at the same time as the ADAT. So that makes it a 12 input audio interface, which is pretty cool. That's enough for a band, that's enough for this, plus my voice and a guitar, you know, all at the same time, all running through the same very petite desktop friendly audio interface. So how now do I feel about the Arturia AudioFuse? Well, I've had it a few weeks. It's been sat here on my desk. It's done everything I've asked of it. I've plugged it in my Surface. There's been no problem with the installation. No problem with updating the firmware to 1.1, which is absolutely something you need to do as soon as you get it in order to benefit from the low latency in Windows. It has performed brilliantly in Cubase. It's performed brilliantly in Bitwig. It's given me great latency when playing MIDI keyboards, including the Rolly keyboard that I did a review of. And since I've now opened it up to ADAT and my Eurorack, it's all dealing with all of that brilliantly as well. It's extremely sparkly. It sits there and the lights on it are very and surprisingly bright, and it twinkles away at you. The physicality of it is great. It's heavy. It stays there even with cables hanging out of the side and pulling with my guitar and that kind of stuff. It's very easy to place your hand on it and find the knob to turn it to where you want it to be. The controller software is very comprehensive and usable, although you don't really need to use it that much. When recording in a general mic and guitar and the odd line input kind of way, you don't really need to refer to it, which is ideal because you want that hands-on, instant, press a button, make it happen kind of experience. But if you want to delve that bit deeper, if you want to create monitor mixes, if you want to start using the ADAT through and doing things with that, then the software is absolutely up to the job. And it's totally scalable. You make it as big or as small as you like, and it appears at the touch of this button. I do really like that. It does have its little quirks like the moving of the knob and the detection of the cables. But in everything that matters, like the low latency performance, its connectivity and its physicality, it's just ace. Now at £500 or thereabouts, it's quite an expensive interface, but you do get a lot, or rather enough for that money. It kind of puts it in the range of the Audient ID44 or even some of the UAD Apollo desktop interfaces. But the AudioFuse actually has a much greater feature set than those. Perhaps it doesn't have all of the I/O of the ID44, but it has MIDI, which the Audient doesn't have, and it has phono inputs, and it has this very compact size, whereas the Audient is much bigger. It doesn't have plugins like the UAD stuff does, but then I find the UAD plugins are they're kind of tailored and specific to people who are doing lots of audio recording, who are recording bands or groups of musicians, and it really favors that style of studio recording, which is not really my thing particularly. And then of course both the USB Twin and the new Apollo Arrow lack any of the sort of I/O that you get with the AudioFuse. So how well then does it stack up in terms of my own search for the perfect audio interface? Well, yeah, pretty damn good. And the reality is I've now bought this. Now, yeah, I know. Reviewers, yeah, we all get everything for free. No, that doesn't happen. That's an absolute rarity. And of course, very welcome and very nice when it does. But no, I've had to buy this with my own money, my own saved up pennies. But I believe that the size of this, the controls, the I/O, the ADAT bit, the potential for expanding into my Eurorack into and out of, the performance, the low latency, the software, the whole package, even kind of the Frenchness of it, I really, really like. I even like the lid, for heaven's sake. Oh, it does get warm. So yeah, this is now mine. It will feature in all my videos from here on in. And if it goes horribly wrong over time, I'll certainly let you know about it. But otherwise, I can heartily recommend it. I mean, you know that I think more or less everything is pretty awesome, but this has definitely tipped the scales. And it has officially become my audio interface of choice. So there you go. I hope that was helpful. I hope that was useful to you for someone who's been looking at the AudioFuse and how well it runs on Windows. That, I think, explains it. If you've enjoyed this video, then please share it, subscribe, tell your friends, stick it on Facebook, or if you're even more daring, you could visit my Patreon page and think about giving me a couple of dollars, because it's those sorts of dollars that help me afford new bits of gear and also continue making these sorts of videos. So that'll do, and in the meantime, go and make some tunes.